Well, hello everybody, and welcome to another virtual edition of Behind the Baton, our lecture series here at the Topeka Symphony. My name is Kyle Wiley Pickett. I'm the music director and conductor for the Topeka Symphony. And before we do anything else, I want to do a big thank you to the Topeka and Shawnee County Public Library for hosting these. You know, when it's not a pandemic, we do these in person at the library, and right now during the pandemic they are hosting us virtually, and so thank you so much. We're very grateful to be partnering with you. We have a really marvelous concert this weekend. We are performing our February 13th concert of this, our 75th anniversary season with the Topeka Symphony. This concert is called Gems for Orchestra and Cello. We have two marvelous pieces on the docket this weekend, two pieces that are personal favorites of mine. We are beginning the program on the first half by featuring our own principal cellist, Iman Chalshatori, who will be playing the Elgar Cello Concerto. And then on the second half of the concert, after a brief intermission, we will be playing one of my favorite symphonies of all time, Johannes Brahms' wonderful, magnificent, romantic Second Symphony. So two great works on this program for you this weekend. This weekend we are going to be live streaming only. Because of COVID restrictions, we are not going to have any audience members in person in the hall. So it will just be a live streamed performance, and I do hope that people will join us to watch our live stream of this concert. So, you know, for this Behind the Baton, what I think I'll do is I'll start. I want to talk a little bit about both pieces that we're going to play, and I'm going to show you some examples as well. So let's just jump right in with the Elgar Concerto. And before we talk about the piece, I want to just talk a little bit about featuring one of our own musicians. You know, we have soloists on many or most of our concerts, although this year with the pandemic that has changed a little bit. But every year I do like to feature someone from within the orchestra or within Topeka. And this concert features Iman, our principal cellist. Iman has just done a magnificent job. He's a marvelous player. Now, he has been featured before, but only in a duo concerto. Iman and Jolt Eder, our concertmaster, played the Brahms violin concerto, Brahms double concerto, concerto for violin and cello a couple of years ago. And that was a magnificent performance. And but I wanted to give Iman a chance as a soloist. And so when we talked about what piece he wanted to do, he mentioned the Elgar Cello Concerto, and that is one of my favorite pieces in the repertoire for cello. There are some magnificent cello concertos. It has a great repertoire. Of course, the Dvorak is one of those pieces. Schumann wrote a marvelous cello concerto. There are Saint-Saëns and Haydn cello concertos, but the Elgar, to me, is one of the greatest of that genre. It just makes the cello speak or sing in a magnificent way. This was written in 1919. The first performance was in 1919. It was the last work that Edward Elgar wrote. I mean, he did a little bit more composing afterwards, but nothing of much substance. It was written right at the tail end of World War I. So coming off of that just terrible conflict in Europe. Edward Elgar and his wife Alice had, prior to the war, spent a lot of time in Germany. They had many friends who were German. They vacationed in Germany, and they were very distressed to find themselves as political enemies, at least the English and the Germans as political enemies. And of course, we know that the World War I took just an enormous physical toll on on Europe, and there was so much devastation and death and then disease following. It was a terrible time for Europe, and a terrible time for the Elgars, and Alice Elgar, Elgar's wife, was ill at the time. But Elgar himself had come out of being sick and having kind of a rough patch, and emerged from the hospital with this idea, and it was the idea for this cello concerto and some melodic ideas, and he approached the composition of this piece with an almost manic intensity. He composed it in the summer, in the woods, in a cabin where the Elgars went and stayed. And you'll see this as a theme throughout music. A lot of composers did these retreats in the summertime. We're going to talk about that a little bit when we get to the Brahms symphony as well, where they would go off into the woods and spend some time by a lake or in the mountains, where they could be apart from society and just concentrate on their composition. And that's what Elgar did for this piece. This is a 4-movement concerto, which is a little bit unusual. The standard concerto form is 3 movements, kind of a fast, slow, fast. And this piece is in 4 movements, but the first 2 movements go together, and then the 3rd and 4th movements go together. So there's really a break in the middle. So even though it's in 4 sections, those divide into kind of 2 halves of the concerto. It's a powerful piece. It's a noble piece, but it's also a very personal and private piece. And that is, I think, reflective of the emotional state that our composer found himself in. The concerto actually had a really rocky start. Its premiere did not go very well. The piece was premiered on the opening night concert of the 1919 season of the London Symphony. It was the first concert after the war, after the symphony restarted after the war. It was a concert that was conducted by Albert Coates, although they had invited Elgar to conduct his own premiere, to conduct the cello concerto premiere. And Coates was not very generous with rehearsal time. In fact, he didn't give Elgar very much rehearsal time at all. And so for the performance, the orchestra had barely spent any rehearsal time on the piece. And it was a rough first performance. It wasn't especially well received by the audience, and the critics were somewhat harsh. But fortunately, shortly thereafter, the piece got quite a bit more performance time, and with better rehearsals, and it was immediately loved by the audience, and kind of launched right into being a favorite cello concerto. It is a piece that was really made famous by the English cellist Jacqueline Dupre, who was a young cellist married to the conductor and pianist Daniel Barenboim, and the two of them performed the piece all over. There were televised performances. They were kind of the rock stars of the classical music world. And so I thought we should watch a little bit of a performance by Jackie Dupre. This is a clip from the first movement in a televised performance conducted by Daniel Barenboim of the Elgar Cello Concerto. All right, let's talk about Brahms' Second Symphony and indeed the composer Johannes Brahms himself. Brahms is my favorite composer. I just connect with his music. I love his music. I think part of what appeals to me so much about Brahms as a composer, he's very much a romantic. His sensibility, his emotional content is expressive of his personal feelings, of his emotions, his thoughts, his inner life. But he's also a classicist. He's a scholar and a study, and and was incredibly influenced by the classical style as established by Mozart and Haydn, the contrapuntal style, which is the way notes move against other notes or lines move against other lines, which was perfected by J.S. Bach in the Baroque era. To me, Brahms contains the ideal combination of head and heart, or intellect and emotion. And he always leaves me wanting more. There are some composers who leave me wanting less, but Brahms always leaves me wanting more. As a young man, Brahms was a pianist. He was a pianist and an aspiring composer, and was best friends with a wonderful virtuoso violinist named Joseph Joachim. And Joachim told Brahms one day, "You have to meet the composer Robert Schumann." Schumann was not just a composer, he was also an influential writer. He had a music journal, and was married to Clara Schumann, or Clara Wieck, who became Clara Schumann, who was one of the world-famous piano virtuosi. She was kind of, probably had the same level of fame as say, Madonna in the pop music world. And so Brahms was introduced to the Schumanns, became fast friends. Robert became a sort of a mentor to him, and Clara and Brahms connected on a deep emotional level. So fast forward a number of years, and Robert Schumann is dealing with mental illness and depression, attempts suicide, and is sent to an asylum. And Brahms becomes the go-between between Clara and Robert. The doctors at the asylum will not let Clara see Schumann, and so Brahms becomes the go-between. Brahms eventually moves into the Schumann household, and Brahms and Clara fall in love. And it's clear that this is what has happened. They feel guilty about it because Robert is in the asylum. Clara's quite a bit younger than Robert, a little bit older than Brahms, and the two of them begin what is, to me, unquestionably a love affair. After Robert dies, you would think that would be the time when Brahms and Clara could be together, and yet they decide to live in separate cities. And in fact, for the rest of their lives, they never live in the same place. And no one knows quite what happened or why this happened. They remained each other's closest confidants. They wrote to each other. They were each other's emotional strengths. They were each other's musical partners, really. But they didn't live together after that. And, both Brahms and Clara destroyed their letters before their deaths. Clara floated hers down the Rhine, and Brahms burned the letters that he had. So we'll never know exactly the nature of their relationship, but we do know that they were each other's closest companion. So that takes us to the Second Symphony. And Brahms' First Symphony was an incredible chore for him to write. One of the things that Robert Schumann did, was to declare that Brahms was the young eagle who would be the future of German music, and take on the mantle of Beethoven. And this was a lot of pressure for a young composer. And so poor Brahms, had critics and friends and musicians and the public all screaming at him, "Where's the symphony that is going to take on the mantle of Beethoven?" And for 17 years, more, really his entire life, he felt this pressure to write a major German Romantic symphony. And he used to complain. He said, "You try to do that with the shadow of the great one over your shoulder," meaning Beethoven was looking down on him. And so he made several aborted attempts to write a symphony. He wrote his first serenade, started life as a symphony, and he kind of bailed out and made it into a serenade. His first piano concerto, the great D minor piano concerto, was going to be a symphony, and again he kind of stopped and went to where he was most comfortable, which was the piano. And so it was not until he was in his 40s that he wrote his first symphony, and he really spent I'd say, you know, at least 15 years working on that first symphony. And of course, it was an enormous success when it finally premiered. The critics finally said, "We finally have this heir of Beethoven." And so after he got that first symphony out of the way, it just lifted this weight from his shoulders, and he wrote his second symphony, the one that we're playing, in 4 months over a summer. I mentioned when I talked about Elgar that composers often did their work in the summer. That was Brahms as well. He lived on a lake in a cabin for the summer and wrote this wonderful second symphony. Now, I brought up the story of Clara and Brahms and Robert because I think in this symphony we see aspects of this personal history exposed. This symphony, the second symphony, is a light, happy symphony, a joyful symphony. There's kind of unbridled enthusiasm and joy expressed throughout the symphony. But we also get an amazing emotional second movement or slow movement in this symphony. And this is where I see so much of Brahms' relationship with Clara put down on paper and in musical form. I think the second movement is the heart of this symphony, and it's a movement that is infused with nostalgia and melancholy. And, you know, I looked up melancholy a while back because we tend to think about melancholy as being sadness. But really, melancholy is not so much just sadness as it is thinking about a happy memory and being sad that it's not continuing. So it's sadness at the end of something happy. And I think you see this in this second movement especially. And if we think about the happiness that Brahms and Clara experienced, and then the sense that they decided to separate and not continue that relationship in that same way, I think we see that in this movement. I'd like us to listen to a little bit of that movement. This is the great conductor Bernard Haitink conducting the second movement of Brahms' Second Symphony. We're just going to listen to the first 2 minutes of this, and you can hear this wonderful theme that Brahms uses the cellos to express in what I consider to be one of the great moments of melancholy in music. Brahms' Second Symphony, second movement. All right, well, this symphony is just full of amazing moments. The first movement is very pastoral, almost like a lullaby or a sense of the gentleness of nature. The second movement has this marvelous romantic, melancholic theme. The third movement is very bucolic and light. It's a trio and scherzo. And then the last movement is just this joyful explosion of creative contrapuntal energy that ends in what if we had a live audience would probably be an enthusiastic standing ovation. It's a marvelous symphony. Thank you so much for joining me for this virtual Behind the Baton. Thank you again to the Topeka and Shawnee County Library for hosting this for us. And I hope to see you online for the Topeka Symphony.